All right, so obviously a lot of races for voters to decide on Election Day.
Yeah, we bring you political analyst Ron Shuren to break down the races. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about first the big one that we're still watching very closely, and that's the race for the 5th District. Have you been watching this closely, and what are your takeaways?
I was watching it just a few minutes ago, and it looked like the Congresswoman was about 1,000 votes ahead. I don't know if that conforms to what you've seen. This is a tight race. It's important for Connecticut, but it's important nationally. It could tip the balance.
Absolutely. Were you expecting that to be that close?
Yes, I was.
Okay.
I was. The polls showed that, and this was a very intense campaign on both sides.
So let's talk about the U.S. Senate race here. You would not describe this race as close, although it was closer, I think, than some of the polls indicated. Yeah. Here's the question I have. You have a relative unknown in most of the state, a political newcomer, a staunchly conservative candidate, probably the most staunchly conservative in this state anyway, this election cycle, running against one of the most entrenched Democrats in the state who's held public office for more years than I can count, I think, at this point. Were you surprised that she had the kind of showing she had?
No, I wasn't. I knew there was the Republican base. Dick Blumenthal had been in the high 50s in his previous races, and that's about where he was this time around. Leora Levy was spending money on commercials, and so it was a race to be expected.
Okay, all right. Hang with us for a minute. There's a lot, obviously, we're following from the big board tonight. And Fox 61's Keith McGilvery is back with us now, digging into the numbers. Back to the close race for the 5th District. We're looking at voter turnout. So, Keith, what can you tell us about voter turnout?
Yeah, so let's talk voter turnout if we can across Connecticut. And what I've done here is I've brought up the race for governor here this year in Connecticut. You can see this total here, about 1.24 million people casting ballots in this year's election. Let's take the screen full if we can, because what I'm able to do now is pull up the numbers from the 2020 presidential race involving Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and obviously midterm elections different from presidential cycles, but there we saw about 1.8 million people turn out and vote. So the back of the napkin math here, about a 550,000 or so vote differential between the 2020 presidential race and what we saw in one of the larger races here in Connecticut, of course, that race for governor. So a sizable difference there, folks, but perhaps not all that unusual given that we are in the midterms right now.
And I know that, Keith, I mean, it was the first thing I did when I woke up this morning. I tracked that 5th congressional race just because last night we went to bed and it was going back and forth all night. So what's the very latest? What do we have?
Yeah, you folks were just talking about that race. So what I can do is bring up this 5th congressional district for you here. The differential between Hayes and Logan at this point, 1,825. And it is close. It is one of those races that has not been formally called yet. And let me give you a kind of a feel for how close this is. Turning on our heat calculator here, typically the darker red or the darker blue some of these regions are, the more these localities are leaning toward one candidate or the other. But you can see with your own eyes here, we don't see any deep reds. We don't see any deep blues here. And that really speaks to, guys, just how close this race is right now, and a lot of eyes nationally on this race, of course, as the president within the last hour or so saying really not the red wave some had anticipated. The margin here between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to leadership in the House could be far smaller than what many anticipate. So folks, want to know who's going to represent them in the 5th District, folks in places like Danbury and Waterbury, but big picture across the country, where will that balance of power stand in the House?
Yeah, I know. We're watching that specifically, the 5th District. Can you, I don't know if you have context for recounts in the state, but we could be heading for, or a recount or for this race. Is this unheard of?
No, it's not unheard of at all. I would want to know right now, though, where there are any outstanding votes. Are they in Waterbury? Are they in Danbury? Are they in some of the more rural villages? That may determine how the final count turns out. But then, of course, as you say, there could well be a recount.
Yeah, we could be there. I know Emma's going to talk about that in the next hour if you're curious about a recount. And I know Keith just ran back over to the screen to see if he can zero in on some of those towns. Why do you say that specifically? Because the towns have a higher population?
Well, because the towns have a proclivity to vote for one party as opposed to the other.
Yes, okay, awesome. All right, well, thank you, Ron. Hopefully we can get Keith to look at that possibly in the next hour as well. So we appreciate you.
Sure.
For your time.